Right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is really a privilege. It's an honor to be here today. I think Janani and I have known each other now for almost a year. And I have come away just really impressed, not only with her faith journey, but also the positive impact that she's made with Christian schools throughout North America, as well as other organizations. So it is a privilege to be here today. We do have a presentation deck that Janani will be sharing with you. So maybe we'll go to that first page and I can start sharing a little bit about myself as we go through the first several pages. What I love about Janani is that she is an optimist. And so when we talk about nonprofit leadership, Christian education leadership in dynamic times, I think some of you would actually probably say that there's a little bit of chaotic times as well. If you think about the last 3 or 4 years, and we've, gone through COVID, now the post-COVID, hybrid work relationships, increased technology. The last couple of months, I've had numerous conversations with my clients about artificial intelligence and how is that going to impact their school or their organization. And so it definitely is a dynamic time. And my perspective and my experience has also been that it's had quite an impact on the governance models of organizations and schools as well. So a little bit about myself. I live in Austin, Texas. I actually live in a condo downtown, as you can see from that picture there. For 23 years, I served as CEO of Lutheran Social Services of the South, which is now branded as Upbring. We'll talk a tiny bit about that today as an example. And around when I was 60 or so, four or 5 years ago, decided that we had such a great succession plan in place and that maybe my successors could even do a better job than I did. So decided to take a little bit of a mini sabbatical and then created CEO Board Services, which works with private universities, Christian schools, nonprofit organizations, and foundations around the country, primarily on topics of governance, strategic planning, succession planning, mergers and acquisitions, coaching, and the like. I've been privileged to also have served on 13 different boards of directors. In fact, my first experience which I had absolutely no qualifications for in many ways, other than I've gone to Christian schools my whole life, is I served on the board of a local Christian school here in Austin, Texas. I've also served on numerous other nonprofit boards, chair of Thriving Financial, which happens to be a Fortune 500 organization. Currently serve as board chair of Thriving Charitable, and then Lutheran Hour Ministries, which spreads the gospel throughout the world. We actually have offices in 36 different countries and use a lot of different technology strategies to spread the gospel throughout the world. So that's a little bit about me. My previous background, I actually worked in politics and law. Served as an attorney in Chicago, worked in politics in several different cities and in Washington early in my career. And I've also written 5 books, the latest being The CEO and the Board, which is maybe the next slide. And when I write books, I like to write on topics that I know about, but also I don't quite feel like I've gotten it right. So I've written a book on living a life of significance. I've written a book on executive values. But it's this book that, I was trying to bring in my experience as a board member, my experience as a CEO, and now my experience as a consultant. And also understanding that what may have worked 5-10 years ago may no longer work today. And that's the fruit, that's the result of this book that I finished during our COVID period and has been out now in the market maybe 9 or 10 months. And I think it's timely for a lot of reasons. If you go to the next slide, Jenny, then yeah. It's interesting to me. I think at times, all of us who've been leaders, all of us who've been board members, get frustrated with the governance process. Peter Drucker, the famed consultant, talks about, they typically don't function. John Carver, who's a nonprofit consultant, talks about, boards tend to be made up of groups. It's an incompetent group of competent people. And oftentimes I think there's some truth to that. And it gets a little bit frustrating, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so. But it's also very vital and important that we get this right, because what the research has demonstrated and what I talk about in the book is that there is a direct correlation between governance and organizational culture and strategy and long-term organizational success. Now, it's a difficult group. I call it in some ways a group dynamic function in that oftentimes, for example, my experience joining the Christian school decades ago, board of directors, is that we often come to boards with absolutely no experience in what to do as a board member. Even those of us with experience, I think what leaders would crave is to work with a board that adds value to the organization and is a truly a strategic partner, a partner with them as the executive director or CEO or leader. I think what good board members crave is to actually make a difference so that they leverage their time, they leverage their knowledge and their unique experience to be that good strategic partner. And how to accomplish this is actually what we're going to talk about for the rest of our time today. So the next slide, and this is the slide that we're actually going to spend very, very little time talking about because this is the science of board governance. And we all have to do this, right? This is the beginning point, but it's never the end. And so you think about your responsibilities, your fiduciary duties as a board member. You've got the duty of care. It's the standard of a reasonable person. You've got the duty of loyalty, the understanding that the organization comes first. So maybe you want to be their attorney or maybe you want to be their financial advisor. You've got to put the organization's interest first as opposed to your own personal interest ahead of that. And then duty of obedience. Are you following all the regulations and the laws in the land and make sure that you don't engage in any unlawful activity, to make sure you do the audit statements and the 990 audits and all of those things that go along with the science of board governance. And, it's not necessarily always easy. I think BoardSource, which is a nonprofit organization that helps governance organizations provide good governance, talks about 8 essential practices, 16 recommended practices, 5 compliance practices. But it's a list and it's a check mark. And all of us, if we're intentional about this, can do that. So we're not going to talk about that today because we're assuming that this is the starting point. But what's in many ways even more important is to talk about the art of governance, which is yes. And so the art of governance is this application, and it's the intentional application of board members and leaders, creative skills. It's your diverse experiences. It's your emotional intelligence that as you lead and as you govern the organization. And so there's an art, for example, of talking about strategy, of raising the elephants in the room, of being an effective board chair, of working and developing trust and integrity between board members and the leadership team. And it requires intentionality and it requires passion for the mission of your school, for your organization. It also requires, obviously, emotional intelligence. And so the question becomes, all right, we know that this is important. It's actually also the fun part because you get to use your own unique skill sets and God-given talents to better your organization. So the question becomes, how do you do this, right? And so if you look at the research and if you look at the next slide, they're really, and we'll dive into both of these a little bit more detail, but there are really 2 key predictors of long-term organizational success. One is, what's the relationship between the board and the executive director or the president or the CEO? And then 2, do you have actually an effective board governance model that you are actively implementing? So what does that mean? So if you go to the next page, so here are what the research demonstrates to be the non-negotiables. And I know Jen's going to be providing everybody with the opportunity to get these this PowerPoint presentation after our conversation today. And so no need to take pictures, no need to write things down because Jen will very graciously hand this out and hand the presentation out to everybody, which is great. But there's 6 non-negotiable, and here are the first 3 according to the research, and obviously my experience and others as well. One is there trust, integrity, intentionality, respect, and openness between the leadership team and the board of directors? So one of the ways to ask this is, does your board and do you as a leader have the ability to engage in a healthy conflict or a healthy dialogue? Is there that trust and openness where you're talking about literally everything and you're not afraid to bring anything to the table? The second non-negotiable is, as you think about your school, as you think about your organization, is do you have a very focused mission and reason for existing? The example I like to use is actually John F. Kennedy's speech, obviously decades ago now, where he announced that in 10 years, we were going to put a man on the moon. Now, what's neat about that is every single employee of NASA understood what her or his mission was in order to accomplish this mission, what their role was going to be, what their reason was for existing. In my own old organization, we used to have a very broad mission, providing help, healing, and hope to the children, elderly, and the poor in the name of Jesus Christ. It was a nice mission. We served elderly, we served children, we served the poor. But the problem with that broad of a mission is it didn't allow us to say no. It didn't allow us to focus on what we were really best at. And it was hard to describe to everybody. So as we dug into what we were best at, what we could make the most impact in the future, we realized that we were best at breaking the cycle of child abuse here in the state of Texas. And what this allowed us to do by having that intentionality of being focused, and in an education world, it could be we're going to train for students are going to be the first generation college graduates. We're going to have academic excellence. We're going to have a Christ-centered education in everything we do. But the question becomes, what is your focus? And by having our focus mission in terms of breaking the cycle of child abuse, what it allowed us to do is to create an advocacy program, to sell retirement communities, to create research partnerships with organizations like the University of Texas, to create educational programs such as Head Start programs, charter schools, faith-based schools, because we knew that in addition to social service, education was a key component to helping to break the cycle of child abuse. And it also allowed us to change our brand. We're still very faith-inspired, very faith-based, but we also wanted to invite everybody to join us in this mission. Again, a third non-negotiable is intentional succession planning. And so the question I like to ask people is what one of your goals should be after you leave your organization 5 years from after you've left. Is your organization better off today than it was when you were there? And that takes both emergency intentional succession planning in case something happens to the CEO or the CEO leaves, but it also takes long-term succession planning, which I talk about in the book as well. The last three non-negotiables, there we go, is one, it's a culture that holds yourself and each other accountable. So what are you measuring? Is the board actually have a process where they hold themselves accountable? How do they hold the leadership team accountable? It could be metrics, it could be KPIs. And knowing in this day and age with the environment, with our culture and with our external environment changing so rapidly, these may even change within the year, but they're important to have. You may have to zig when you thought you were going to zag, but you also always need to have that North Star so you have things to measure. I like to talk about it in terms of what's the one thing you're going to do that's really exciting in the first year to keep that momentum going. What are the 2 or 3 big things that you're going to do in the next 3 years? And then how do you build that operational plan around each of those? The fifth one may be in some ways the hardest in this day and age, because what I've noticed and found in the past 10 years is that the need for really experienced board members has become greater and greater as our organizations have gotten more complex and as the external environment is changing more and more rapidly. And so the question becomes, for your particular organization, and it's going to be different for each and every one of you, is what is the diverse group of relevant skill sets and perspectives and life experiences that you need sitting around your table to be able to have those strategic dialogues, be able to wrestle with the elephants in the room, to understand where you need to go in the future. It's harder and harder, and I've had a number of conversations with boards about this and organizations, and it's harder and harder to recruit people, one, with the right skill sets, two, that have the time and willingness. And so a couple of the recommendations that I've had is, think about maybe decreasing the size of your board of directors. Sometimes that helps in terms of your ability to recruit. It also helps in that there's something called social loafing, where if you have a very large board, oftentimes board members will say, well, they don't really need my talents at this meeting, and so I'll rely on other people to do it. If you only have 6 or 7 people sitting around your table, it's really hard to social loaf. And so that's one option, in addition to maybe extending term limits, et cetera, just to ensure that you have those different generations, people maybe with technology backgrounds or global experience backgrounds, whatever you need for your organization. And then finally, it's the understanding that each of our organizations is unique. And so what makes the most sense for our particular school or organization? So the question becomes, what are the feedbacks? And I'm looking at Jen. Do you want to jump in here? Please.
Yeah, so we're just going to do a quick survey because we want to kind of get your thoughts on, what are the challenges and what are you guys facing? And also just want to get your thoughts on this. So we have a one survey question that we would love for you guys to answer. And I'm going to just launch that right now. And you guys let us, if you guys can, do you guys see this on your screen right now? The survey questions? If you do, you can put thumbs up.
Yeah, that may be the second one, Jen.
Oh, sorry, guys. Maybe the wrong one. I apologize. We're learning. Sorry, guys. One more time. Let's try this again. There you go. You can try that now. Sorry.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the question becomes, are you satisfied with your governance process? And, I can share with you, in many boards and many in the organization in which I served as CEO, there were years where I would answer this no. There were some years where overall I was very satisfied, knowing that there were times and opportunities to improve, because this is a never-ending process, right?
We'll give them maybe 30 more seconds. If you guys can answer the question, that'll be awesome. And then we'll go back to the presentation.
So I serve on 3 different boards of directors right now. I would answer yes for one, maybe for the second, and no for the third.
I know, maybe we should have like which board organization, because we participate in so many of them, right? So
right.
That is true.
But think about your primary one, I guess.
Exactly. So we have the answers for the second one too, Kurt. So we'll just move on. And
yeah, absolutely.
Second survey. Okay, awesome.
Absolutely.
Just a few more people answering, and then I think we're good to go. And then I'm gonna end the survey now. I think we're good. Okay. And then let me show you guys the results. Can you guys see or no? I can. Hopefully you can see. Okay. So we have about yes 1 and 9 no. So these are questions. Are you satisfied with your school or organization's current governance process? So that's a big number, Kurt. So I'm glad we're doing this webinar.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't surprise me, sadly. And it's interesting, and I think it's gotten more and more difficult since COVID. For one of the reasons would be that during COVID, most boards obviously could not get together in person. And so, oftentimes we would make do, we would meet by Zoom, and then because of COVID, oftentimes board members would have to drop off. We'd bring in new board members. There wouldn't be that relationship building that typically occurred when you met together in person. And as a result, and also the executive director, the CEO, they were having trouble building relationships with the board members as well, for all of the reasons that we know about. I talk about the obstacles facing good governance in terms of 2 different buckets. One is plumbing and the other is people. And so one plumbing obstacle may be, if you look at some schools or congregations or nonprofit organizations, their bylaws, articles of incorporation, they may be 40 or 50 years old. And so what made sense back at the time doesn't make sense anymore. So I know of one congregation that had a requirement that they had 30 board members. They needed to have 30 board members. And the problem is this congregation has shrunk and they're now down to 60 people. And so it's obviously not going to happen, right? Or how do you select your board members? Is it through associations? Is it through voting with your memberships? All of those pieces that made sense in the past may not make sense now. So it's always useful to review your bylaws and procedures to make sure that it makes sense for this particular day and age. If you look at most board meetings are structured so that we look backwards. We're reviewing financial statements. We're talking about all the great things or challenges that we had in the last quarter and the last 12 months. What my recommendation is that you intentionally focus at least 50% of your board meetings looking forward. So it may be educating your board about changes in the external environment, new things that are happening in the education world, new things that are happening in technology. I'm going to a meeting in a few weeks where we're talking about the potential impact of artificial intelligence on our particular mission. So continually focusing on educating the board, continually having those forward-looking conversations about what is our mission? How do we get it more clear? What are we actually here to accomplish so that we can improve our local community, our mission, etc. It's also, because we have been in some ways unable to build those relationships. I just worked as a consultant with a couple of different organizations where they had not met in person for the last 3 years. And so we specifically built in time for a board retreat where we got to know each other. The board members got to, have dinner together, have breakfast together, maybe a fun activity together, because relationships matter, emotional intelligence matters in terms of building that trust and building that integrity and being able to work together as a team. We talked a little bit about clarity of mission. What is your elevator speech? Can every board member, can every member of the leadership team in a 2-story elevator ride talk about what is the mission of our organization? I'm also seeing that every single organization, no matter how good it is, has an elephant in the room, oftentimes due to the changing environment. So as an example, there is a Christian school that all of a sudden got competition from a charter school that opened down the street. That's an elephant in the room. Or maybe the financial model that worked in the past no longer works. And it's vital for boards and the executive team to sit around the table, to raise the elephant in the room in a trust-filled, blame-free environment, and to then wrestle with it and figure out what is the right solution going forward. We talked about having the right skill sets and life experiences sitting around that table. That's a people person, right? Where, who is needed to be around the table to help you as a leader to make good decisions, to talk about where you're going strategically. So those are what I would call issues of plumbing and people. In the next slide, what we talk about is understanding also that there are different seasons of an organization's life. And so what I mean by that is there are going to be times when a board needs to lean in. It may be selecting the next executive director. It may be a time of crisis. It may be, pivoting to a new mission. I'm working with a private Christian university where they're pivoting to focusing almost exclusively on educating students who are first-generation college students. That's in some ways, a new focus mission on them. And the board necessarily has to lean in because they got to make sure that they're doing this right. I worked with an organization where there was a merger between two. And during that merger conversation, obviously the board needed to lean in. Then there was an issue. And so during that crisis, they needed to lean in. And they, in some ways, got used to it. And so what they forgot was, all right, so now we're over this. We need to let the leadership team do its job of running the organization, of bringing the two organizations together. And we're not going to be as leaning in as we used to be. And so it's often helpful to think about where you're at in the season of an organization's life. Yes, you're always going to continue to fulfill your fiduciary responsibilities, but there are going to be times that you're going to also be leaning in or leaning back, knowing what's best for the organization. So the question, and this was the second question of the survey that Jen put out, is what is this is applicable to your own organization? What's working? What's next? So maybe Jen, the next slide would be great. And so I think if you learn anything from this presentation today, what I would ask for you to do is think about what are the one or two challenges or opportunity that is right for your organization. Also understanding, and we'll get to this in the next couple of slides, what's working, because there are things obviously that's going to be working probably with virtually every organization in terms of board governance, in terms of strategic planning, but also even the best of organizations always have room for improvement. And so what are the two or three things that with intentionality that you can improve? Do you need to recruit board members with more intentionality, the right specific person? Do you need to spend more time meeting together individually or as in person as opposed to Zoom meetings? How are you going to restructure your board meetings to make them more effective? Do you need to bring in a facilitator to help you and your board get more clarity of strategy? All of those are pieces of that puzzle that connect governance to culture, to strategy, to long-term organizational success. So finally, the last two slides, or actually not the last two, but two in terms of this particular topic, is how do you know whether or not your governance model is going to provide you with, you can call it a missional advantage, a competitive advantage. And the research is actually pretty clear on this. So what I've done is presented a scorecard with 8 different questions of how for you to assess whether or not your governance model is providing with that missional advantage. First of all, is there a healthy, trusting relationship between the executive director and the board of directors, and then within the board of directors as well? As executive director, as president, are you comfortable sharing everything with the board, the good, the bad, and the ugly? Is there this shared focus of proactively and intentionally looking strategically into the future? Have you identified the elephants in the room, and are you wrestling with them in this blame-free, trust-filled environment? Then the next slide gives the last 4, and it's, is your board, do you have the right skill sets, and is it appropriately diverse, sitting around the table in all sorts of different ways? Just one quick example of that. When I was working at Upring, we served undocumented minors that were crossing the border along the southern border of Texas. And obviously, we're seeing that a lot in the news today. And our organization has done this through 4 different presidents over the last 20 or so years. But what was interesting is in the previous present administration, all of a sudden it got to be more political as opposed to simply just caring for the least of these. And so it was helpful for me as CEO to have both Republicans and Democrats sitting around my board table to give their unique perspective. And then we could then wrestle with, what do we want to do? How do we want to continue to serve? And what this allowed us to do is to understand and to be placed in each other's shoes, but also then at the end of the day, come to my opinion, the right decision that we're going to keep politics out of this, but we're going to continue to serve the least of these because this is what Christ wanted us to do. Also, a big believer in proactive succession planning. The research is clear that, and for every organization, this is going to look a little bit different, but especially for larger organizations or schools where you might have a young teacher who's interested in someday becoming an administrator. What can we do to help with providing additional skill sets and training to the people around us so that one day they may be potentially able to succeed us as that leader? The research is very clear that unless the organization or school needs to have a strategic pivot, you're much more better off going on with a qualified internal candidate than taking somebody from the outside. There's just less risk, and you can continue with that, your mission going forward. 7th is, you have that clearly defined focus strategy. as we've talked about, do you have clarity? Do you know what you're going to accomplish in the next year, in the next 3 years? And then, does the executive director feel supported by the board? And does the board feel supported by the executive director? And what I mean by that is oftentimes being a leader of a school, leader of an organization can be a very lonely role in that you truly don't have any peers other than maybe some in other positions outside of your school or outside of your organization. And so oftentimes what is just really helpful for that executive director is to know that the board has his or her back and know that they're being 100% supportive. Always understanding that, yes, there's room for improvement. As a CEO, I can improve every single day, but that we as a board and the leadership work together as a team. And especially in this day and age where we're judged 24/7 on social media, social media sites such as Glassdoor, where you can now rank the executive director, or you can be criticized by your employees or stakeholders. This is in some ways more important than ever, as it's in my opinion, the board's responsibility to ensure that there is a healthy environment for their leader to work in. So the last comment that I'll make before we turn it over to questions is, and I work with both faith-inspired as well as secular organizations, and I love working with both. But if you go to the next slide, what's great about those of us who work in faith-inspired, faith-based organization, Christian schools, is that we can openly bring our faith, our entire being, to the table. And I think that gives us an advantage, a missional advantage that maybe other secular organizations quite simply may not have. Understanding that they do important work and are really vital to our communities, and I have nothing but the greatest respect for them. But when you think about it, and I in a past life wrote a book on executive values, a Christian approach to organizational leadership. And the last slide just gives a few examples of this. But, as much as I like my business book that I wrote, the Bible is the ultimate business book in terms of teaching us how we can successfully lead our schools, our organizations. Here are 3 that I like to lift up. But the other one that I love to lift up is, that follow the golden rule. If you follow the golden rule in terms of serving your employees, your stakeholders, your students, your clients, and treat them as you would want to be treated, you're pretty much on your way to leading a successful organization. So with that, Jen, I will take a breath and see if there are, I think there's maybe one more slide just in case they want to get my email address. But Jen knows how to get a hold of me as well. So Jen, let's open it up to questions maybe.